that is done. So my name is John Esterly. I am the executive director here at All Aboard Ohio. We are one of Ohio's premier passenger rail and transit advocacy groups. We have chapters across the state, including Columbus, Northeast Ohio, Southwest Ohio, the Youngstown area. We've got a fairly fresh Dayton chapter, and our friends at NOPRA are in the midst of coming on board as our Northwest Ohio chapter. So very excited to talk about not only passenger rail and the expansion that we're seeing here under the Corridor ID program and others, but also localized public transit, things like Link Us here in Columbus, the expansion of BRT service in both Cleveland and Cincinnati, and anything else that we can do to help move people around better. So today, we're going to be talking about something that's maybe a little bit different for many of our advocates, and that's the environmental impact and benefits of passenger rail and transit. So we've talked quite a bit about the societal impact, um, the things that it can do to make people's lives better in a very direct way. But today, we've got a group of folks here that are going to talk with us about the impact that better public transit has on our environment, which does have secondary societal impacts as well. So I'm going to really quick talk about who we've got here today, and then I'll turn things over to our moderator, and she will prompt our guests for some more formal introductions and tell their stories a little bit. So first, we're very fortunate to have Lena Reynolds from the Environmental Law and Policy Center. She is their communications and policy advocate based in Chicago. I had the opportunity to meet Lena when she was in the Columbus area last month. Pete Butcher, who is the Chief of Staff for the Ohio Environmental Council based here in Columbus. Pete and I have worked together on a number of things in the past. Again, very excited to have him on board to talk about kind of statewide advocacy in the environmental space. And then finally, David Reeves, who serves as the Chief of Staff for Cincinnati City Council member Mika Owens. David's going to talk a lot about initiatives that they have very locally in Cincinnati to help in terms of transforming environmental policy at the local level. And again, very excited to have these three folks join us today. And last and not least, our moderator today is Liz Quigley. She is the program manager for co-cultural and community initiatives at Ohio State's Sustainability Institute. Liz and I got connected through Transit Columbus, a local transit advocacy group here in the central Ohio area, and she is much more able to lead this discussion than I am because this is her area of expertise. So with no further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and I'm going to turn things over to Liz to get started with our guided forum. And folks, feel free to drop questions in the chat. We'll address those at the end of the guided forum, and then we'll also have an opportunity for you to raise your hands and ask questions after we kind of ask and answer the questions we've got prepared. So with no further ado, Liz, I turn things over to you. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, John, for taking over those introductions. And hello, all. It's such an honor to be here with you today with all these passenger rail nerds and being able to talk about such an important topic of the intersection between environmental issues, sustainability, and mobility across Ohio and across the country, across the world. So, as many of us probably know, transportation is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, which can lead to air pollution impacting human health negatively, can lead to warming temperatures, extreme heat, as well as extreme weather impacting human health and well-being. So this is an important conversation for us to have today to see what are the intersections between protecting our environment that we need to be relied on for healthy and happy communities, as well as the environment that our passenger rail and mobility systems are reliant upon as well. So I will let our experts today take over in explaining the work they do from a regional to local level to protect our environment, to engage transit and mobility in this space, and to make sure we have access to happy and healthy communities. So Lena, I'll go ahead and pass it to you, and then we'll follow with Pete, and then David, would you be able to provide an overview of your organization's work and go ahead and tell us about how your organization interacts with transit?
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for having me here today. This is definitely a topic we love to engage in when we can. So the Environmental Law and Policy Center is the Midwest leading environmental legal advocacy organization. So we'll do things like sue polluters to protect clean air and water, or help craft new policies for clean energy and clean transportation initiatives. We work in 9 states from the Great Lakes to the Great Plains, and have an office in DC as well to coordinate with federal agencies and Midwest representatives in the US Congress. So I'm on the communications and transportation policy teams. And the Midwest is really important when it comes to environmental work. It's the crossroads of America. The nation's energy and transportation networks crisscross through here. We have the Great Lakes, the world's largest freshwater, fresh surface freshwater body. So there's a lot of great environmental organizations on the coasts, but the Midwest is our home, and we know that, the heartland really matters for making a difference on the environment. And so for transportation in particular, we know that this is a hub for interstate travel. People flying, driving, and taking the train often crisscross to and through here. So there's a lot of travel emissions happening. And so we can make a big difference, in Midwest states for reducing some of those emissions if we can help people make cleaner choices. We also have a lot of historic towns and cities that were built around walking and rail. And so being able to make the most of those and help people protect the historic infrastructure is also really great for sustainability. So that's just a little bit of our work, but I'm sure we'll get into more.
Yeah, I can go next. Pete Booker, I'm the Chief of Staff for the Ohio Environmental Council out of Columbus. As John said earlier, the Ohio Environmental Council's mission is to protect the environment and health of all Ohio communities through legal and policy advocacy, decision maker accountability, and civic engagement. And generally, our 4 focus areas from a policy perspective include clean water, energy and climate change, public lands, and democracy. So we really look at the intersection of all those issues for all the Ohio communities that have a number of different issues, try to solve them through policy. Our work interacts with transit in a number of ways, but primarily it involves looking at public policies at the local, state, or federal level to reduce carbon emissions in the sector, dealing with climate adaptation for our communities, and funding infrastructure improvements to make sure our systems are up to a standard to be resilient.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah, I'm David Reeves. I'm from the city of Cincinnati. I am the chief of staff for Councilmember Mika Owens, who is the chair of our Climate, Environment, and Infrastructure Committee. So kind of the perfect crossover for this conversation. In 2023, she led the revision of Cincinnati's Climate Action Plan, which is called the Green Cincinnati Plan, which was started in 2008 and has kind of been, Pete, I don't know if you have an objection to this, but we like to say that Cincinnati is paving the way for climate action in Ohio in a lot of ways. And, you know, we're trying to find the intersections across multiple areas, whether it's food access or transit. In fact, one of the 8 focus areas from that revision was mobility, where we called out specific things that we need to be doing to address transit issues, whether it's pedestrian safety, bicycle infrastructure, or our larger transit network of bus rapid transit and more, what the city needs to be doing to address that. So, our office is having check-ins with the Ohio Environmental Council, our transit authority here in Southwestern Ohio, consistently to understand how we can continue to support and grow their work. And yeah, it's kind of just a touch all, because the environmental issues and transit issues don't just live within those silos. It takes all of us to really understand that we can support a good economy, we can get better jobs if we understand that environmental issues are important, and so is mobility.
Thank you all. I love how you all touched on one, the emphasis that your work supports communities and really looking at the intersections between not only the environmental space versus all these other spaces, but how these are all interconnected. And with those interconnections, David, if you could start on speaking to some of the environmental issues that you see in Cincinnati most impacted by transportation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as will continue to be the talking point, emissions are the biggest issue. In Cincinnati, in 2022 we tracked where the majority of our emissions come from, and almost a third of our emissions come from transportation in Cincinnati. And so it's the simple equation of when you have more cars on the street, for individuals, single rider vehicles, and then you have buses or you have other forms of transportation that can get those cars off the streets, we can reduce those emissions. And so our buildings, all of our buildings across the board, industrial, commercial, residential, they are number one, but then transit is going to come in at number two in emissions. And so we're trying to identify how we can continue to grow transit. And in Cincinnati, we've been very proactive in passing our transit levy. I know Columbus just did this past November, but this has put our transit above pre-pandemic ridership levels, which is something that is insane considering how transit is having trouble recovering from the pandemic. But instead of cutting service, as a lot of transit authorities did during the pandemic, our transit authority took a second and grew service, actually, because we had that sustainable funding model. So here locally, it's how do we get cars off the street and people using our bike network or microtransit or our larger transit infrastructure, which requires city-county partnership, a little bit of state conversations, but that's really the big issue is we have to get cars off the roads.
And Pete, would you be able to share at the statewide level where you're seeing this impact on the environment from different transportation modes that we currently have and are envisioning?
Yeah, generally, a big focus for us is on the impacts of climate change. The transportation sector was stated and known on this call, generally one of the largest contributors for carbon emissions in the country. And so for us, it's about finding ways we can reduce those emissions, because that'll be necessary for Ohio to reduce its overall overall contributions to climate change. Excuse me. So we also look at ways we can make the more resilient state while we're experiencing the already present impacts of climate change. So for the transportation sector, that's generally going to look at focusing on our infrastructure to make sure our roads and bridges and railways are up to date and resilient enough to handle severe weather events that we're already experiencing. So for rural communities to make sure, roads aren't getting washed out or trails aren't getting washed out, and we have what we need to deal with severe rain, severe weather generally.
And Lena, go ahead and tell us about the Midwest impacts that transportation might have on the environment.
Yeah. So it's same as these folks have been saying, emissions are a big part of it. And there's like carbon emissions in terms of the climate impact, but there's also a lot of other pollution that is created by cars. And that affects, communities that live along highways and corridors with a lot of trucks. And so the more that we can kind of help people make choices that reduce those emissions, are more clean, more efficient, the healthier it is for people on an individual and a community level. So in the Midwest, we've seen that similar to some of these other folks that transportation is about a third of the emissions. And even though we've gotten a little cleaner in our energy sector, there's a lot of work people have done. We've got like LED light bulbs and things like that have helped to reduce energy emissions. Transportation has actually continued to go up. Even as vehicles have also gotten more efficient, people are driving farther and more often. And so I think there's a lot of questions about improving transit to kind of help meet some of those needs and different travel needs that people have. And so places that have been able to increase frequencies, make the most of the existing transit networks, have seen the best benefits. And so I think the recent bipartisan infrastructure law helped to increase a lot of infrastructure needs that like Amtrak and passenger rail had, and by adding more trains, helping to improve usage of the existing system. Amtrak had the highest ridership year ever in 2024. And so I think that's a really great sign that people want to use these systems, and the more you can increase frequencies, such as the new train from Chicago to Minneapolis, the more people will ride it. They like doubled ridership expectations. So trains are really energy efficient. You get a lot of people riding in one car, you know, rather than individually. It's a lot more economical, and it also brings people into downtowns, to the heart of our communities, where they can frequent small businesses. So it's good economically and environmentally.
I just wanted to add one thing there because that's a great stat about Amtrak having their highest ridership. In Cincinnati, again, we're seeing the growth from our transit authority, which is primarily buses, but a city asset that we have is our streetcar. And I know we have a couple people here from the Southwest Ohio region. Every month, we are setting a new ridership record in Cincinnati. But when it comes down to it, most people are driving down into the urban core and then getting on the streetcar. We do have a lot of residents in downtown, but that's why our transit authority is trying to incentivize free transit days on Reds opening day, which is a Cincinnati holiday. When the Bengals went to the Super Bowl, there were free rides down to downtown to catch watch parties or whatever else you need to do. So we're trying to incentivize people to start, taking that first step to get on our transit system and then use the streetcar to get around our, urban core as much as possible. That's really awesome about Amtrak.
Great. And Lena, you set us up for our next question. With different issues such as emissions, deforestation due to urban sprawl, there are so many environmental issues that we're facing across the Midwest, across the country. So with going beyond just the Amtrak expansion or diving deeper into that, how can different forms of mobility, from passenger rail to bikeways, help address the environmental issues we're facing?
Yeah, I think the air pollution is, the thing that people think of the most, but there's a lot of other impacts of transportation. I think microplastics, like one of the biggest sources is from car tires. So like having more people in, more energy efficient and like steel rails means there's less of that. It also, though, I think sprawl, like you mentioned, is one of the biggest things. We have really great kind of downtowns in a lot of the cities and towns across the Midwest. And, then people kind of spread out, and it means that there's less space for forests, less farmland. If we can, make the most of those downtowns and help people to live closer, where they can walk to things, they can bike to things, they can take the transit systems that exist in some of these cities, then it's more efficient, and it also helps to protect those natural areas outside of the cities and towns. So passenger rail can help us to, visit wonderful natural places, but it also helps to make sure that those places continue to exist, and that the ecosystems that we depend on, the biodiversity that makes our food system healthy, and the farmland that we all depend on to eat, can also continue to thrive across the Midwest.
Great. And Pete, if you would be able to expand on that as well, and spaces you've seen transit help address environmental issues in Ohio.
Yeah, I think, these alternate transit opportunities not only gives an individual options for their day-to-day life to help move themselves forward, but more than likely alternate options to just a passenger vehicle are probably going to be an option that's lower carbon emitting. And so that's going to help us reduce our overall carbon emissions, help fight climate change. And I really like the last point about just connecting our communities. And so can have a lot of economic impacts as well, to make sure people can get to shops, work, school, daycare. The more options, the better, to really give people what they need to move their families forward in the day to day.
David, if you'd be able to expand on the local level, and I liked just touching on the point of, you have existing infrastructure in Cincinnati, but people still have to drive to get there. So what are the environmental impacts of that disconnected system, those disconnected communities within the community? And what potential do you see for supporting the environment through changing that system?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's massive. Cincinnati is kind of a cut up jurisdiction in a lot of ways. If you look at a map, there are just gaps of the city that are missing because of the jurisdictions that are in Hamilton County. But our council was really focused in addressing how can we better connect our communities. In fact, we passed a policy called Connected Communities, which was outlined in that mobility focus area in our climate action plan, which basically says that transit, we want to incentivize development along bus rapid transit lines, which our transit authority is currently starting to develop, which, some of people's happiest memories are at Disneyland or Disney World or college, where everything was within a 15-minute walk of everything. And so we really are trying to replicate that around our neighborhood business districts. Cincinnati has 52 neighborhoods. And so each one of those are very different in a lot of ways, but the majority of them have business districts. And we want to incentivize people being able to live around those areas. So having the development of middle housing, which means the quadplexes and the condo developments that are townhome developments that are helpful to have just more neighbors. That is a really strong way that the city has seen. Let's start making people get better connected via our transit lanes. Also, this past fall, my boss advocated for $2 million to go towards the connection between our downtown and kind of the University of Cincinnati area with a protected bike lane, which is something that we see as a critical piece of our infrastructure going forward. Right now, Cincinnati is working on a 34-mile loop around the city called the Crown. This is for bike and pedestrian infrastructure. It's a protected trail that goes through multiple jurisdictions in Hamilton County, but these directly will affect the environment. I know that I have multiple coworkers at City Hall who bike to work every day who don't live in the urban core. And so we're starting to see that behavior change. And at the local level, we know that climate change is going to take behavior change. And it means getting people, when you're taking a school on a field trip, how about you walk the trail? How about, you take the metro, or you work with the transit authority to take the metro and show kids that, transit is safe. Our public school system, everyone above 7th grade uses our public transit system to get to school. That has issues. I'm not saying that that's a touch-all solution, but we are trying to help incentivize people to getting on the bus a little bit more. And it will. You don't see the effects, the benefits of climate change tomorrow. I think that we'll begin to see that here in Cincinnati over the next 5-10 years, and it's going to be amazing.
Right. And looking at, we've already been talking a lot about how the transit, passenger rail mobility movements can support the environmental movement, but kind of twisting it the other way, how can environmental efforts, so addressing climate change, addressing biodiversity, all of these other issues, support opportunities for alternative transit and passenger rail?
Yeah. I think that everything is intersected in one way or another. My boss is a big fan of not talking about policy issues as though they're in silos. And so you can talk about transit issues and environmental issues in the same breath. You can talk about economic development and transit issues in the same breath. And so we know that the 3C+D plan, I also have taken the Amtrak out of Cincinnati before. It was a harrowing experience, I will tell you. A 17-hour train ride from Cincinnati to Washington, D.C. is not what I was expecting. It was supposed to be 14 hours. We had a little delay. But it's going to take a conversation of outside of our former magnificent train station that is still being used as a train station, but is also our museum center now. It's a parking lot. It's zoned for parks and recreation. It's owned by the city. It used to be, this is where the Cincinnati Reds first ballpark was. It was a beautiful park, but now it is all asphalt. We need to figure out how we can have effective green space and grow green space and reduce impervious surface and stormwater runoff and all of these things as we're thinking about welcoming people to our city from these other forms of transit. And so that takes, having more green space and tree coverage and all of these things. With the bus rapid transit, I know some offices at City Hall have talked about, if you plant trees and line streets with trees, although they might not be parkways, it definitely changes the quality of life, because people take pride in a neighborhood when there's green foliage and a community garden or whatever it may be. So we know in our office that we can have these conversations in the same breath, and that's why mobility is called out in our climate action plan. Although our office really wants to have a regional transit plan for how are people getting from Cincinnati to our international airport that's in northern Kentucky. But that all requires understanding that this will reduce emissions. This will have other impacts across the board. So
I'll pass it to you, Pete, to tell us how that looks at the statewide level.
Yeah, and I'll do a little bit of state and local in my answer because we do that local engagement as well. So I think generally just the direct advocacy from environmental groups or environmentalists can really help push alternate transit opportunities and hopefully in doing so lower carbon emitting policies and opportunities as well, especially in the major metro areas, as David has been talking about a little bit. These communities likely have some version of a climate action plan or maybe a full-blown transportation plan where their guiding principles for their transportation policies are likely going to live. So engaging on these plans when communities either are developing them or maybe re-reviewing them after a certain number of years have gone by is a really critical opportunity to make sure that people are seeing what they want in their guiding principles for transit policy and alternate transit. And if it's not there, making sure that that desire is heard to the decision makers. And so the state level is working on some climate planning now in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act from the Biden administration. And so similarly, just at a different level of government, those will be really critical opportunities to try to engage in as well to make sure people are seeing what they want from their policies, whether it's more alternate transit, more climate friendly policies or something else entirely. But those are really critical opportunities. And then just to give a specific example from our 501c4 organization, the Ohio Environmental Council Action Fund, we saw that earlier this year, we're still 2024, as a chance to engage directly in the democratic process to advance positive alternate transit policies. So right here in Central Ohio, as it was hinted on, we were able to work with leaders of Central Ohio community, successfully pass issue 47, which was the Link Us initiative from the Central Ohio Transit Authority. So this levy, for those that may not be familiar, will fund massive overhauls in our public transportation system right here in Central Ohio, including new bike lanes, pedestrian infrastructure, and citywide bus rapid transit options. So this could be a successful model of how to engage communities that want to pass similar initiatives, or if there was ever going to be a statewide initiative to see something like rail funded through the taxpayers. This could be a really good model of showing the overlap of not only the benefits to economic development, but the benefits of setting up our future housing corridors, because it's going to be along the transit lines and the opportunities, or to see the environmental benefits because carbon emission reductions will be a result of seeing less people use single passenger vehicles on a day-to-day here in our region, to just really build that out. And each part of the state or statewide has different challenges to building out that kind of messaging campaign. But I do think it was a good model that could be used elsewhere if the ballot is a route for seeing some of these changes.
I think from an environmental perspective, like thinking of how environment can help transportation as well, the environmental community has, I think, talked a lot about electric vehicles for a long time, and that's certainly part of the equation. ELPC works on, electric school buses, which we think is a really great opportunity to electrify because they have really clear routes, a clear plan for charging, and it's actually the form of public transportation that serves the most people across the United States, because kids, are a lot of communities across the country are using them. But I think there's been a real shift in the last few years for environmental groups to talk more again about things like walking, biking, and transit. And ELPC has always worked on passenger rail and some of these transit things, but it's been great to see across the environmental movement more of a focus on that perspective again. Because there's a lot of resources involved with electric vehicles. And, for many communities, that's absolutely the solution. People need to drive in a lot of places. But to have the efficiencies of walking, biking, and transit, making the most of the downtown communities that we have is going to get us to our environmental goals faster. If we can make sure that people don't have to drive and have other options, that's more economical, it's going to get us, to lower emissions faster. And it's also got a lot of other, benefits for communities. So I think that conversation needs to be kind of hand in hand, right? How can we think about all the transportation solutions and what's going to work best for each community, and for people to make the choices by trip too. It may depend on where you're going and what kind of options you have, but making sure that people have options.
I love that all of you have emphasized the fact that none of this happens in a silo. All of these movements, infrastructure are interconnected. They're part of our communities from the local to global scale. So starting with you, Lena, because we've talked about these different movements. So we have obviously our transit movement here, our environmental movement, but I've also heard economic development mentioned, infrastructure, housing, health. What opportunities are coming up for the environmental and alternative transit movements to collaborate to address these larger issues that truly just impact communities?
Yeah, I think collaboration is the most important thing for getting advocacy done, because people come from different perspectives and there's different challenges that they're kind of most concerned with. And sometimes the solution can have many different benefits. So we've been talking about kind of the intercity travel of passenger rail, has a lot of benefits for connecting communities, and that it really helps downtowns. It helps small businesses by having people, right there rather than having to kind of come in from an airport, right? So I think it's really important to be thinking about all of that at once. The environmental perspective may not be the most salient for, the business organizations downtown, but they have just as much to gain, if not more, than some of the folks that are concerned about, species outside of the city. So there's a lot of interconnections there. Absolutely.
To you, Pete, to expand on that.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think there could be a lot of opportunities to collaborate. And really the key when trying to figure out that overlap is where are their mutual goals, where are their mutual interests, and then figuring out, maybe from the environmental community to the alternate transit community, what are your strengths and weaknesses, and where can you be supportive of each other's, messaging or engagement or lobbying, depending on what you're doing. And that could be things like jointly advocating, for specific policies or funding down at the State House through things like the transportation budget or other legislation. It could be figuring out how to best communicate directly with Ohioans about the importance of any issues to build support for things like more rail options in the states, or more bike or pedestrian trails, depending on what the focus is. And I think whenever you build new coalitions, it can really perk up ears with different decision makers. And so when they see different folks standing shoulder to shoulder, showing an overlap of interests and issues, that can be really powerful.
Yeah, I think there's always an intersection between environmental issues and how we can better address transit connectivity or whatever else. I know, and this is going to sound really weird on this call, but the city of Cincinnati had a railroad which spanned from about Cincinnati to Chattanooga, which we just recently sold to help address our infrastructure issues. And the Ohio Environmental Council actually helped and endorsed the sale of that asset so that we could better address our deferred maintenance issues. But something that was really important, and we met with the Southwest representative from OEC this week, is there need to be climate goals to addressing these deferred maintenance issues. And so that relates to in fixing road improvements and traffic signals and parks and recreation and all of these things. But there are moments where OEC or other environmental organizations, we have a great sustainability organization here in Cincinnati called Green Umbrella, and they are always at the table when we're talking transit. Tri-State Trails, who is doing that Crown network, is always at the table when we're talking about a regional connectivity plan, because it's not just buses, it's not just cars, it's not just bikes. people get around our city and our communities in a ton of different ways. And so making infrastructure that's helpful for, I know somebody in the chat just said in Toledo, disability advocates are at the front line of leading on transportation issues. And I've seen that in Southeastern Ohio too, when I was working a summer down there. And, people think about mobility on demand services primarily for individuals who have disability issues. But here in Hamilton County, I live a little outside of the city. We have mobility on demand service right around my home. And so how can we continue to make transit accessible and have that address environmental issues? Of course, it's always going to come back to emissions, but somebody who wants to get from their home to the park where there's a food festival or the flea market, all of these things are intersected. And if people are communicative and collaborate really well, these situations and collaborations are really effective.
And to finish us off with our formal side of today's discussion, as you all are well aware, you're on a call with a bunch of passionate and wonderful transit advocates. What would you call upon them to do? What can they do as these transit advocates fighting for transit at the local level to passenger rail across the country to support environmental efforts through the work they're doing? And we'll start with you, David.
Sorry, Liz, could you say that one more time? Sorry.
Yeah. What can the transit advocates on this call do to support environmental efforts through their work?
Yeah, I would say keep on getting into this space. I know that I've geeked out with Mitch, who is a part of All Aboard Ohio. I've met John at a sustainability conference down here in Cincinnati. And I think that it's finding those natural intersections or also not. Like, do you really think that transit and economic development or environmental issues go together? Sit down with someone who may be, a subject matter expert and figure out how having more transit options relates to those issues. And so continuing to be in these spaces, continuing to build coalitions are always really effective. And I know that in our office and at the city of Cincinnati, we're always looking for people who can bring multiple lenses to policy issues and really be effective in communicating that out to the public. And so we know that the best person to communicate the issues of today out to a community is the people in that community. And so we really look to you all on this call who are transit advocates to talk about how if we have more passenger rail, it means less people on the interstate, which means less, emissions overall. So just ball in your guys' court a little bit. We're always going to be here to support and pass policies to help your work, but we, turn to you all to help us.
Chime in with your final thoughts.
Yeah, and I think the quickest way to support work of environmental organizations like ours is to get connected to the tools and resources that we publish to try to make getting involved as easy as possible. We know everybody's got a lot of issues that require attention in your day-to-day lives. And so I think groups like ours that work at a statewide level try to make information on things like legislation accessible, first of all, and then understandable. So that way, it doesn't require multiple hours of research to get your head around an issue. Try to really connect it to the point. Maybe it's lower energy costs, or it's more carbon reduction emissions, or more transportation options, to just make that through line to make it really clear why certain actions can do what we want them to do from a legislative advocacy perspective. And then plug into tools that we have like action alerts so that people can connect directly to the relevant decision maker on an issue to help cut through the bureaucracy and get straight to the source rather than trying to have to navigate that on your own, which sometimes can be complicated depending on the level of government and what tools they give you. And then through our OEC Action Fund, when you get to an individual level of wanting to just get your head around what relevant issues are out there, or maybe when you're going to go vote in a given year, we have things that help you compile legislation that we're following. So you can quickly see, all right, I care about an energy issue or water issue. Here's that category and really what is happening. And then come election time, tools that really show you candidate stances on issues. So you can see really who's stepping up for the environment in their year or their term when you go to make those critical decisions every couple of years in your community, so you can choose what's best for you. And then look for ways to collaborate. I really liked what David was saying about telling groups that do what we do what is important, to make sure that we're always connecting it to what your community needs and is seeing. And it's not just a top-down telling folks what's needed. We really look to have a two-way information street, so that way we're constantly ground truthing kind of what seems like the solution, but making sure that it's plugged into reality for communities.
These guys already said so much. So I definitely all of that. Being able to speak to your state, your local representatives, your Congress folks, when the opportunities arise, those voices really matter to them to hear from their constituents. So when things like action alerts, pop up, that kind of is a great chance to make it really easy and contact your folks. But yeah, I think that's kind of the bigger picture, is talking to elected officials, but really in your local communities too, connecting with folks, connecting with other organizations, and trying out some of the transportation options in your community. Is there a new bike lane that you haven't tried? If you can give that a shot and tell a neighbor about it, it may be, a new option for them that they hadn't thought about. Same with just getting on the bus sometimes, right? It may be easier than you thought. So I think there's a lot that we can do from the local to national level to try and make these systems more available for people and to work a little bit better.
Cool. Well, thank you to all our panelists for sticking through this discussion and sharing these wonderful insights with us all. I'd now like to pass it to the audience to share some questions you all might have, and feel free to put your questions in the chat or unmute yourself. But John, correct me if there's a better way to do that.
Yeah, again, feel free to put questions in the chat. And if you want to put your hand up, if you've got an audible question you'd like to ask Brian, I'll ask you to kind of keep an eye on things too, so that we've got multiple people. With me sharing the screen, it's kind of difficult for me to manage. So cool, thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything you guys are saying about how to advocate. I guess more directly to Pete and David. To me, following the data, passenger rail is the best way to make an economic impact. Looking at the ORDC and the fact that passenger rail advocate spot has been vacated for so long, what can we do as advocates for trying to have a change on the environment here, compel our elected officials to prioritize getting that spot filled?
I can probably take a swing at that, because that's kind of in my bailiwick. You're absolutely correct that commissioner representing the interests of passenger rail has been vacant essentially since it was created. I would say there are 3 other seats on the commission that expire this year, so we're expecting some new appointments to come in the new year. And I am doing everything I can to ensure that that is one of the appointments that comes. So I think at this point, it probably doesn't make sense to make an appointment right before we're making 3 more. But we are working very closely to make sure that that gets filled. Kind of out of the other side of my mouth, I would say that, although it is good to have that voice represented on the board, until very recently, I'll just say it out loud. We did not have passenger rail in a meaningful way in the state of Ohio. So to have somebody there to represent those interests, I could at least understand it not being a priority to fill that. But now that we're in the new world of corridor ID, and particularly with the Rail Development Commission being the folks that are tasked with completing that, I think it is going to be at least something that we can justify in our advocacy. I hope that answers your question, Steve.
Yeah, let's see. Youngstown, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Do we still have a question?
Oh, I still have your hand up. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
we did have a question, but it might have been answered, but I just wanted to ask a question about why that rail from Cincinnati to Chattanooga was sold.
Yes, great question. So this was an asset that we had a lease agreement with, a freight line, which I think everyone, if it's a little bit of a sore spot, I understand it was kind of a controversial vote, but we saw it as a way for us to address our deferred maintenance going forward. So Ohio Revised Code says that we can only, we have to put it into an investment, and then we can spend the interest that we make off of it to address our deferred existing infrastructure. And so this means that Cincinnati is facing, $300 million in deferred maintenance over the next 10 years, I believe. And an effective way for us to do that is either to grow revenues or look at our assets and find ways that we may be able to make more profits from those. And so it has been projected that from our first return from our investment of the sale of that railroad, which was $1.6 billion, we are making more than how much the lease was per year. So we're going to be able to do more with those dollars going further, and we can only expect, fingers crossed, that the economy continues to stay strong and that we can continue to put that into deferred maintenance. The impetus of selling that was that this lease agreement had kind of gotten to a point where I believe, and these conversations were happening before I got to City Hall, but we were really looking at our assets and where we may be not having the best deal coming out of it. And so I think that the freight provider was also looking to take sole responsibility of that asset as well. And so the city and the voters of Cincinnati overall decided to sell that asset so that we could better address our deferred maintenance issues.
Thank you.
Yeah. Also, this is like one of the only municipally held railroads that still existed to this point. And so it was kind of weird to step into City Hall and learn that the city of Cincinnati had ownership of a railroad that was being used by a corporation to move freight. So we were just entering into lease agreements over and over and over again. But sorry to cut off whoever I did. I apologize.
David, there was another question that came your way earlier in the chat. Some of the folks in Northeast Ohio were asking if you could give a little bit more detail on the sustainable funding transit model that you had mentioned, and how there were, the Cincinnati Public Transit was able to increase some service. You had made some comments about sustainable funding for that. I think there was hope for more clarity on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really similar to, I haven't digged really deep into the CODA transit levy, but I think it's very similarly structured. It's a 0.8% sales tax in Hamilton County that goes directly to our transit authority to support their operations, fleet improvements, opening new transit centers. And also, like, kind of the best part of it is that they're also improving some roads in the process. So as we're building out bus rapid transit, they are going to use probably some of these dollars to go towards, establishing those corridors to be a little bit more pedestrian friendly, bike friendly, and also just better for the buses. This also comes with, anyone in Southwest Ohio will probably know the Western Hills Viaduct really well. A part of this sale supported funding for the Western Hills Viaduct that really needs an overhaul. And luckily, Metro, who is our regional transit authority, is kicking in some funds to support that. And so we're talking millions upon millions of dollars every single year going into our transit system and into our infrastructure to support our transit system. And that's kind of the sustainability, the sustainable funding model that's gone forward. Also getting electrified buses, hydrogen buses, all of these things. I kid you not, if it would be helpful for you all to have a transit authority panel, I would be happy to connect you all with our regional transit authority. They love talking about all the things that they've been able to do with those dollars.
Great, thank you.
I
Let's
see
see.
a
And go
question
ahead.
in the chat focused on the potential professional and upcoming job opportunities in the space with 3C and D and just the general push for alternative transit. So would any of you have responses in that space? In terms of job development that might be coming.
I can take a stab, but I do have the local mindset here. Um, I really thought about how our sustainability director at the city loves to say, the greenest building is the building that's already there. And so as we're talking about the development of, having to have more stations or whatever it may be, we're talking about improvements for the rails themselves to where the trains are getting to and fro. And so having LEED certified buildings or green building standards brought into that, energy benchmarking as we are constructing those buildings. When we're having conversations in Cincinnati that like when we're building something in Cincinnati, we want it built for and by Cincinnatians. And so really talking about how we can build up Ohio's economy and Southwestern's economy by having folks that are from here being invested not only in the ideation of that, but in the execution of that. I don't know if anybody else on the panel can talk about kind of the job effects.
Lena, maybe you could expand into just green jobs. Obviously, a lot of federal and state funding has been going into that space. Are there any intersections with the transit move space with that funding and establishment of new career pathways?
Yeah, it's my understanding that transit and passenger rail creates more jobs per dollar than highway expansions. And highway repair also creates more jobs than highway expansions per dollar. So in terms of like the job creation and the investment in our communities, kind of making the most out of our existing roads, fixing the roads and bridges that we have, fixing the trains and running more trains and more track improvements, things like that, are also good for the economy and the job opportunities for our local communities. So that's kind of one statistic I know. I don't know the jobs numbers specifically for the 3CD and Midwest Connect train lines, but I could probably look them up.
Wonderful. Well, out of respect for everyone's time, I will go ahead and pass it over to John to wrap us up. But thank you so much to our panelists again for being here with us today. And thank you to all of you for coming and learning about how the environmental movement and the transit movements are honestly working towards the same goals together. So John, please wrap us up today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again to Lena and Pete and David, and then to Liz for being our moderator. It is certainly something that we are very humbled to have you folks share some time with us early on a Saturday morning. So again, thank you so much. I did want to pass along some information to our members who happen to be on the call. Probably first, foremost, and most exciting, we need to save the date, friends. February the 19th, which is a Wednesday. All Aboard Ohio is going to be hosting a passenger rail advocacy day at the Ohio State House. For those that aren't as familiar with kind of the legislative cycle, this time of year is going to be right in the midst of the transportation budget negotiation cycle. So our hope is that we can meet with some key folks in that transportation budget, and then also target some of the new legislators that are coming down to Columbus for their first General Assembly, and just kind of explain to them why this is important to us. We're going to have morning advocacy meetings that are going to be hosted and attended by members of our board and other folks in our coalition partnership group, primarily the MPOs and local municipalities. But then we'd certainly like to invite everybody to be here at 5 p.m. We are going to have a reception in the State House Museum Gallery. And again, everybody is invited to be there. So save that date. We had a number of questions about the MIPRIC bill that is currently introduced in the Ohio State House. For those that don't recall, it is House Bill 488. Hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that is very likely to see its end in committee. And I'm not very optimistic that we have a hearing on it next week. Next week is the end of our legislative calendar, unless something earth-shattering would happen, which I don't see happening. So that bill is unfortunately unlikely to make any movement this General Assembly. But as you recall, this was not something that we expected anyway. It will more than likely be rolled into that transportation budget during that next legislative session. So that is one of the advocacy points that we are going to be making as we move forward. Again, February 19th, save the date. And other than that, we thank you folks so much for being here today. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we will see you folks next month.